September 12th, 2017. I started feeling the estrogen more today. Charles' daughter had put me in a blindfold and taken me somewhere. He took off the blindfold and I saw some Christian retreat. The sign said, "Welcome to the San Rafael Ranch." There was a descanso memorializing the victims of someone named Epstein. The place was a ghost of a retreat, was badly maintained and sprawling. There was the gossamer of spiders upon some of the structures. Clearly, even if Christians had retreated here, they'd long since retreated from the retreat. I felt some inkling like I had been here before, but I was sure Charles' daughter knew what was going on. Daughter led me to a log cabin, and we sat inside. The place was more well kept, and clearly, daughter had been here many times. He turned on some fans as we felt the sweltering heat of a seeming warm early summer's day cooling off. I lay on a very comfortable futon as daughter sat in a recumbent ergonomic chair and looked over me like a regal king overseeing their subject. I noticed a little blotter of paper fall away from my red blouse, and I realized it must have been in my mouth while I had been resting. I suddenly felt the onset of a shift in my awareness. I must have been slipped something by Charles' daughter. He smiled at me, and the smile seemed to stretch even further than the Cheshire Cat's grin. As I looked into Charles' daughter's eyes, suddenly I saw a Spanish conquistador reflected in them. And just as soon, what was in the eyes became who was behind the eyes. A boastful Spanish imperialist recounted to me his love of the Pueblo, indigenous women, and forcing them to do his sexual deviance. Suddenly, the eyes widened red with rage, and I distinctly felt I was one of these Pueblo women. I looked at my reflection in the Spaniard's eyes and saw a Pueblo woman. Suddenly, my legs were being forced open, and I was being violated in a harsh, powerless way, with his fingers prying, scratching, ripping at my vulva. I shut my eyes and I saw triangulated visuals. When I opened them, the fingers had become a vibrator, and I looked into a man's eyes that had a fake gentleness, like a wolf in sheep's birthday suit. He violated me ever the more strongly with the vibrator, and all I could do was lay there and be invaded. "Welcome to my castle," he said with a disgustingly smug grin. The pain and the feeling of powerlessness overwhelmed me, and I closed my eyes and screamed like a banshee. It felt better to not see it if I had to endure it. Suddenly, I felt a warm, loving caress, and the vibrator as if disappeared and was no longer in my vagina. Exasperated, pushed beyond the limit of pain and powerlessness, I curiously opened my eyes. A young man without a shirt looked at me. He must have been about 19, looked so desirously handsome, with cute, medium-length brown hair, and smiled with a genuine seeming kindness, so unlike the wolf in sheep's clothing. I basked in the stillness and lull of the moment, contrasted with the intense abuse prior. I heard a voice whisper to me mysteriously, "A Watkins tie with a T is better than an Atkins diet." Suddenly, the image of Susan Atkins triplicated in my vision, but I knew it was just a visual hallucination. Watkins? I puzzled frenetically in a split second. Who could it be? Maybe it was nonsense. Atkins? That girl Charles' manddaughter had been talking about. My thought popped like a sun exploding into a black, wholesome, bottomless pit. I suddenly realized my surroundings more. I was in some different ranch. I heard a mouse squeal from some distance. I saw it scurrying towards me, and the young, handsome man turned in surprise to see what was going on. It let out cries of torment and pain as it reached the center of the room. It fell over, probably dead. It began to decay at a much more accelerated rate, and its decaying flesh transformed into a bunch of little rats, not mice this time. They scurried up the centerpiece in the building and scurried into some miniature replica of a building. Curious, we both walked closer to peer at the replica and see what was going on. The rats had raped and murdered each other, and blood and severed limbs splayed the sprawling replica. My mouth fell open as I realized this was a replica of the San Rafael Ranch. Some of the rats had gone into mouse traps. The young man gently skirted me away from this horrendous scene, covering my eyes and gently stroking me. There are better things to see than this, the brown-haired young man said. I gently moved his hand away and kept it to my face in a defensive posture. I looked into his eyes and I saw James Douglas Manson reflected back in them. My hand flew away from my face, and I wondered if this was now who I was behind my eyes. A sextuplicated James Douglas Manson wandered towards me from all sides, glaring at me and having a hypnotic intensity in the eyes. I felt that their lure was inescapable. The prober was found to be the dominant emerging hierarchy in the aggregate environment of the experiment. Soon other mice followed the prober, severing limbs, raping, and murdering. A hand flew near my face, sweeping and scanning. "Excuse me, hun?" the brown-haired man said. It swept through James Douglas Manson like a hologram, and James dispersed with a temporarily lingering after image of James Douglas Morrison interposed with Charles Manson. "Are you with me?" I fully took in my surroundings now. I walked to a window that was nearby and peered out, feeling the young man's eyes and awareness strict and firm upon me. The mailbox in the distance read, "Spawn Ranch." The young man firmly grabbed my shoulder and turned me to face him. "Where am I?" I demanded. "What is the Spawn Ranch?" He said nothing and grunted with a sudden lunge. I turned and bolted, breaking through the locked door out as I heard more mice and rats squealing in the distance. But at the broken doorway was the menacing face of Charles Manson, leering and obstructing my escape. Something pricked me in my arm vein, and I turned as an intense euphoria onset, and the young man threw me to the floor and ripped off my crimson blouse and bra. He sucked on my tit, and milk began to flow out of it, which he drank with incredible satisfaction. Whatever it was hit me even harder. My vision blurred beyond comprehension, and my body felt like a heavy balloon. I shut my eyes again, and after a long blackness, triangulated visuals appeared and faded away, to me feeling like my eyes were open and seeing, though I felt them closed. The narcotic feeling faded as suddenly as it came. "Charles! Charles Morrison, a loud, authoritative voice was saying, desperately trying to get my attention. Charles Morrison. I am not Charles Morrison. I am Jam Douglas, Womanson, I tried to say, but my mouth opened and formed the words, but no words came out. Charles Morrison. I squinted in my awareness and tried to hone in on who this was. I vaguely thought I will never be Charles Morrison again, and who he is does not concern me. But most of all, the focus on Charles Morrison was like a vortex I could not escape. I felt utterly suggestible in my state. A man with a long black suit and a long overhanging hat of shadows and blackness that seemed to go on forever, who wore black sunglasses, looked at me intently. I looked at the sunglasses to see if I could make out the eyes, and suddenly I saw many eyes looking at me. Each of them reflected the image of a boy. I again distinctly felt I was Charles Morrison. Suddenly, the strange shadow of a man triplicated. 3 sets of dark sunglasses glared furtively, now no eyes visible. I had the distinct feeling that this man was but a hallucination. It was inexplicable. The man's thoughts suddenly pierced into my own. For being Charles Morrison, you must be a Charles Bonnet. I felt for a moment like a living question mark. Then, as suddenly as I had the momentary feeling of the enigmatic, I was somehow able to really open my eyes again. But all I opened to was blackness. I felt sunglasses. The sunglasses were on my face. I took them off and saw Charles Morrison looking at me. Was I the blackened shadow man now? The face shifted with rainbow trails, and I saw Charles Mandaughter looking at me, the wild look of undomesticated pleasure in his eyes. But just as soon as I saw him, he was gone, and now I laid on what seemed to be the bare ground. It was before the ranch had ever been built here, before the Spanish had a land grant here. Inextricably, I knew this. Out of the ground, a woman climbed, digging with skeletal fingers that wrapped flesh around as she reached above the ground and to land at last. I felt an enormously powerful but calming presence as she smiled at me, and her smile too seemed to go to the gulf of all eternity. She did not speak to me, but I felt her thoughts. Charles Morrison is not Charles Bonnet, she cryptically thought to me. I felt I was but an even younger child named Charles Morrison. I felt her spirit grab to my shoulders like the talons of a riven crow. And in one whole moment, I lived as if another lifetime. Charles Morrison. As soon as it came to me, it was gone, other than the vague recollection that something had passed. As she left my awareness, I felt that she would continue to watch over me. This ancient Pueblo woman. She had made it clear that I needed to reconnect with Charles. Charles Mandaughter now appeared before me, and my orientation began to go baseline. Mandaughter leaned in his recumbent chair, scrutinizing me, but with satisfaction from our coitus and my experience. As I lay there in a bed later with Charles Mandaughter and reiterated what had happened, he looked at me and he stroked my hair. He reiterated that it did not matter, that it was no concern. Though him fucking me again, despite how much it hurt from before, helped delay this. Still, some part of me feels drawn to this. Charles Mandaughter knows best, though, and I'm only here to love them. I decided to change the subject. How did the other seaman's surprise go? I asked. dripping wetness and whiteness and catching it to my fingers and savoring each taste of our body essence intermixed.